and we will be presenting here shortly some work that we recently published, which examines some of the financial aspects of utility-owned rooftop solar. This is a project that we've been working on for quite a while, actually, but it finally got published, and so that's provided us now the opportunity to share the work more broadly. Before we begin, just a few of the standard housekeeping items. So on the slide here, you'll see two URLs at the bottom. The first URL will take you to the published version of our paper in Nature Energy. I believe you need a subscription to actually download the article from that site. However, at the second URL there, that'll take you to the publication page on LBL's website for our group, where you can download a preprint of the article, which is a little bit different from the final published version. But you can also, through that site, access a free online only version of the published article. So those are your, I guess, three different viewing options for the full published article, or for either the published or preprint version. Also, I'll mention that this webinar is being recorded, and so we will post a recording of the webinar along with the slide deck at that bottom URL, and that'll go up in a couple days, I imagine. And then last but not least, hopefully you all see a Q&A button somewhere on your screen. So as we go through the presentation, please feel free to enter any questions via that Q&A box. We will hopefully have maybe 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the webinar where we can do some Q&A. But it would be great if you can just enter those questions as we go, and either Andy or I, whoever's not speaking, will kind of get them queued up and ready to go. So with that, let's begin. At least as of a few years ago, we were seeing kind of this increasing interest in direct utility ownership of distributed energy resources and of rooftop solar in particular, often in the context of broader discussions about utility business models or the utility of the future. And over the past few years, we've seen maybe a dozen or so utilities launch pilot programs focusing on utility ownership of rooftop solar. And those efforts have been motivated by a variety of different considerations. First, and maybe most obviously, is that utility ownership of distributed resources provides new earnings opportunities for utility shareholders, which might be particularly appealing in cases where those DERs are otherwise displacing traditional utility capital investments. So that's kind of one of the main motivations that we hear about or have seen when folks have proposed this kind of business model. Utility ownership might also, at least in theory, facilitate higher value forms of deployment. For example, by, say, directing installations towards particular locations on the grid where it might have the greatest value, or maybe focusing on particular technology configurations that offer greater value. Related to that is the idea also that utility ownership might allow utilities to have greater visibility and control over the assets once they're deployed, which can then help to ensure that any intrinsic value in those resources then ultimately gets realized through the utilities' operational and planning decisions. Utilities might also be in a position to procure rooftop solar at relatively low costs, just as a large volume buyer. Utilities also might be able to focus specifically on low income or other types of underserved markets. And in fact, that has been kind of one of the main, at least kind of explicit motivations associated with a number of the pilots that have been offered over the past few years. And through those various mechanisms, it's conceivable that utility ownership might be able to mitigate some of the concerns around cost shifting and equity that otherwise often arise within rooftop solar markets. Notwithstanding those, possible benefits of utility-owned rooftop solar. The prospects for larger scale implementation of that model are quite uncertain, and much of that uncertainty comes from the various kind of thorny policy questions that come up. For example, whether it's appropriate for regulated utilities to play that kind of role. But perhaps more basic than those thorny questions is just really the simple question of whether or not this model actually makes any financial sense, either from the utility shareholders perspective or from the perspective of ratepayers more generally. And it's really that latter and maybe more basic question that we've attempted to address within our work here. So this slide here just shows a few examples of recent utility-owned rooftop solar programs. I'm not going to talk about these in any detail, but you can go back and refer to this later if you wish to. I'd really just point out at this point that these programs do vary quite a bit in their design. Some focus on residential, other on CNI, some with, as I mentioned, kind of an LMI, low and moderate income focus, others not. It's a little bit of a mixed bag, but we mostly just kind of wanted to illustrate here that there are, in fact, some utilities out there that are, or at least have actually attempted to do what we've studied here. Quickly just give a kind of high-level overview of our overall analysis approach, and we'll provide some more details on later slides. But the basic objective of the analysis is to try to estimate the effects of utility-owned residential rooftop solar on both utility shareholder earnings and on non-solar customer bills, or sometimes we call it non-participant bills. So those are the two metrics that we'll be presenting throughout our results, and those reflect the two different stakeholder perspectives that we're primarily interested in for the purpose of this analysis. And so we calculate those effects on shareholder earnings and non-solar customer bills, and then compare them to the effects that would occur under more typical non-utility ownership structures, whether that's either host-owned systems or some sort of third-party ownership structure. And so what we're primarily trying to do here is to show how those two metrics of interest compare when the utility owns the system versus when some non-utility owns the system, as is typically the case. And we do this using a financial model that was developed here at Berkeley Lab called the Finder model. This is a tool that we've used for a number of analyses like this over the years, and that was developed really specifically for the purpose of estimating the impacts of DERs on utility shareholders and customers along the lines of the two metrics that I've mentioned. And then last, in analyzing utility-owned rooftop solar, we focus on a specific program design where the system is installed on the customer rooftop, but is connected directly to the utility side of the meter. And so the host customer receives no direct bill savings benefit, but instead they receive a monthly payment for the utility that in essence is basically a sort of a rooftop rental fee, where the utility is paying the customer some monthly fee for use of its rooftop to host these systems. And this is a program model that has been implemented through a number of the pilots that I listed on the previous slide. Also, I failed to mention that second bullet from the bottom, which is that for the purpose of our analysis, we assume a utility that is kind of roughly representative of an investor-owned utility located in the southeastern US. And we can talk a little bit more later about why we chose that particular utility type if folks are interested in. But for a variety of reasons, it seemed to be kind of a useful set of assumptions for the purpose of our analysis here. So I'll hand the baton off to Andy in a second here, who will then walk us through all of the analysis results. But before doing that, I want to just really be clear about what our analysis does and does not do, because that ultimately will dictate what kinds of conclusions we can draw from this work. And so first, as I mentioned, we're focused on understanding the impacts of ownership structure. So we're comparing outcomes between utility-owned rooftop solar and non-utility owned rooftop solar. And so you might think about this from the perspective of a utility or a regulator who's maybe anticipating some amount of rooftop solar to get deployed and just wants to understand whether allowing the utility to own those resources might lead to a better outcome. That's very different from an analysis that tries to assess whether this is the best use of utility capital. That would be a question that maybe comes up within the context of a utility resource planning process, where a utility is trying to decide which resource out there is lowest cost. That's not what we've done here. That obviously is a very important question, but it's a different question intended for a somewhat different context. Second, we're comparing outcomes here in terms of two very specific metrics, the impacts on shareholder earnings and on non-participant bills. If you are a utility or a regulator and you're trying to figure out whether this business model is a good idea, there are no doubt all sorts of other factors that would go into that decision-making process. And so we're not, certainly not providing a comprehensive assessment of this business model, but are really kind of focusing narrowly on these two specific kind of financial metrics that in some cases might be sort of a threshold question that a utility or regulator would want to know the answer to before it then proceeded to engaging in some of those thornier, trickier policy questions. And then last, our analysis here is based on a particular representative utility, this kind of southeastern investor-owned utility, and a particular program design, which I also described. And we do some sensitivities around our assumptions and also have some kind of qualitative discussions about how the results might differ under other variations in kind of the analysis structure. But clearly we also have to acknowledge that, we haven't covered the entire universe of possibilities here. So hopefully that's all clear. And with that, I will hand it over to Andy, who will then really lead us through the meat of this discussion and present the study results.
Great, thanks, Galen. I'll also take this opportunity just to remind folks that you can submit questions as I go through the material using the Q&A button down at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to those towards the end of the presentation. So as Galen mentioned, I'll begin by describing our base case analysis. We modeled 3 scenarios in the base case and compared them to derive the shareholder and ratepayer impacts under these different ownership structures. So we first model a no PV case. So this is going to serve as the reference level of utility shareholder earnings and non-participant customer bills. Second, we then model a case with host or third-party owned PV that's net metered. In this case, net PV generation is credited at full retail rate. And as mentioned earlier, the PV deployment ramps up linearly to reach 8% of retail sales over 10 years. And to be sure, this is a pretty aggressive deployment level and would place this utility certainly in the top among other utilities in the United States for deployment levels. We extend the analysis period to 20 years in order to capture the bulk of the economic end effects of the PV. So for example, deferred future capital expenditures, which I'll talk about in a bit. The third case that we model here is a case where the utility owns the same amount of PV as in the host or third-party owned case, but with some important differences. So first, the PV system capital costs will be added to the utility's rate base. Second, the rooftop systems are metered separately from the customer's load and connected directly to the utility distribution network. So this means the PV generation does not offset any customer consumption. And kind of the last difference here in case number 3 is that participating homeowners will receive a monthly bill credit of $30. This is set at an amount to roughly yield the same financial benefits as under the host or third-party ownership case. And then we quantify the impacts by comparing each ownership structure, cases 2 and 3, to the no PV case, or case number 1 in this figure, as our reference. Next slide, please. As a general matter, the finder model defers generation, transmission, and distribution investments based on reductions in net peak demand. So regardless of the ownership structure, we assume the reduction in peak demand is the same. More specific to the investment types in the model, rooftop solar results in peak demand reductions which defer utility capital expenditures, or CapEx, on large-scale generation assets. So to reach the terminal PV deployment level of 8% of retail sales in 10 years, we add 350 megawatts of nameplate PV capacity on a cumulative basis. This in turn reduces the utility peak by about 110 megawatts and shifts the timing of the peak demand, net PV, later in the day, and this is based on our assumptions about the utility hourly load shape and hourly PV production profile. As a result, the solar defers 4 natural gas turbines generation additions by about 1 to 2 years each over the 20-year analysis period, and you can see those deferrals in the figure on the left here. I'd also note that the rooftop solar also defers growth-related transmission and distribution CapEx based on the change in the system-wide peak. While this is a somewhat simplified approach as opposed to modeling specific individual feeders, in our analysis it yields a T&D deferral value of about 2 cents per kilowatt hour of solar, and this is generally in line with more and other detailed studies that have been done. Next slide. So we'll move to the base case results, and I'll begin with the utility shareholder earnings impacts in our different ownership cases. So first, the aforementioned generation and growth-related T&D CapEx deferrals reduce utility achieved earnings for both ownership cases and by the same amount. In the case of the host or third-party owned, this is a result of lower load growth and reductions in utility peak demand. In the case of the utility-owned PV, the solar PV becomes a new generating asset for the utility and therefore defers the need for incremental generation resources, as well as, again, similar to the host-owned case, a lower net peak demand that results in lower growth in T&D system investments. Next slide. Under a standard host or third-party owned structure, shareholder earnings are further eroded as a result of reduced retail sales, which is depicted in this green bar in the figure. In fact, this is the primary source of earnings erosion. This effect often arises under cost of service rate making when utility rates are set every several years, but sales growth lags cost growth in the intervening years. And it can be further compounded in cases where utility revenues are predominantly collected via volumetric energy sales. This is most often the case for residential retail electricity rates. Measures that reduce sales growth, such as rooftop solar connected behind the customer meter, as in this host or third-party owned case, amplify this effect. But we don't see this in the utility-owned PV case, this effect of reduced retail sales, because the rooftop solar is instead connected directly to the utility system and not behind the customer meter. Next slide. The last source of earnings impacts is that when the utility owns the rooftop solar, the earnings erosion from the deferred generation, transmission, and distribution CapEx are more than offset by the additional earnings gained on utility capital investments in rooftop solar, and this is depicted in the yellow bar. This largely follows from the fact that rooftop solar is more capital intensive and has a lower capacity factor than the generation resources that it defers. I will add that we do not show the impacts of reduced fuel and purchase power costs in this utility earnings results figure, because they're assumed to be perfectly collected from customers via an annual cost tracking mechanism, or in other words, this is often called a fuel adjustment clause, and therefore it doesn't impact utility earnings either way. Comparing the two ownership structures then, in the case of earnings impacts, we observe utility ownership of PV, as we've modeled it in this study, results in a net gain in shareholder earnings compared to the net loss under host or third-party owned solar PV. Let's go to the next slide. I'll now turn to the effects on non-participating customers as measured by the change in average non-participating residential customer bills. So first, in both cases, generation and transmission deferrals reduce customer bills, as do the savings on fuel and purchase power cost associated with electricity generation that's displaced by the output from the rooftop solar. Again, these cost savings are the same in both ownership cases because of the same reductions in net demand. Next slide. In the host or third-party owned case, the cost savings to ratepayers are offset due to increasing retail rates. So retail electricity rates are essentially the ratio of utility costs to utility sales. And within our analysis, rooftop solar reduces retail sales by a greater amount than it reduces utility costs. So this leads to higher retail rates, and in turn, it leads to higher bills for non-participating customers that we've depicted in the green bar here. Next slide. Under the utility-owned rooftop solar program on the left of this figure, the cost savings of CapEx deferrals and avoided fuel and purchase power costs are more than offset by the interest and depreciation expenses associated with utility investment in rooftop solar, as well as the operating costs of running the rooftop solar program. So again, if we compare these two ownership structures from the perspective of non-participating customers, we observe that non-participant bill impacts are roughly the same. Let's go to the next slide. As Galen mentioned, we also performed a variety of sensitivity analyses in order to test both the robustness of the results to key uncertainties underlying the effects I just described, and to identify potential pathways to improving the financial performance of the utility-owned rooftop solar program. Next slide. So the first sensitivity case we looked at was potentially lower deployment levels. So as I mentioned before, our assumed 8% residential rooftop solar penetration level would, by most standards, represent a highly ambitious program, certainly at least an order of magnitude larger than any of the existing pilots we researched. Smaller scale programs would yield smaller effects, though not necessarily on a pro rata basis. For example, generation CapEx deferrals in particular tend to be quite lumpy, right? They're triggered at specific threshold reductions in load growth. Other dynamics as well, for example, the effects of adding PV CapEx to the utility rate base and the effects of reduced retail sales may be more linear in nature. So what we did was we looked at the sensitivity case of a lower deployment level, and we see that for the particular utility and the conditions we evaluated, the linear dynamics tend to dominate, and the overall impacts on utility shareholder earnings and customer bills scale roughly in proportion to PV penetration, at least up to that 8% deployment level that we considered in the base case. So we can see this in the figure, which shows shareholder earnings on the left and non-participant bill impacts on the right at both 2% and 8% of residential sales for both ownership structures. At 2% penetration, no generation deferrals occur, yet the net effects are more or less proportionally lower than the effects at 8% penetration. This linear relationship, of course, may break down at higher penetration levels if, for example, high rooftop solar penetration triggers costly upgrades to utility distribution systems or the need for additional flexible generating capacity. Let's go to the next slide. As Galen mentioned earlier, one potential benefit of utility ownership is that it may better enable the utility to direct deployment of rooftop solar toward those locations where it provides the greatest deferral value and imposes the lowest integration costs. The clearest example of this strategy among existing pilot programs involves targeting customers with west or southwest facing rooftops. So orienting rooftop solar in this manner would yield generation profiles that align more closely with the timing of utility system peak load, which then allows for greater deferral of future capital investments to the extent those investments obviously are driven by peak load growth. So to test the efficacy of this particular strategy, we consider a scenario in which the utility sites rooftop solar exclusively on west-facing rooftops, as opposed to mostly south-facing panels as in our base case. Orienting panels westward does further reduce the utility's peak load, though by only about 3% more than in the base case. As you can see in the figure, this yields some modest additional T&D deferrals, but the incremental peak demand reductions are too small to yield any additional large-scale generation deferrals. So as a result, shareholder earnings impacts are effectively unchanged from the base case, though more significantly, orienting the panels westward reduces solar generation by roughly 14%, which diminishes the savings on fuel and purchase power costs compared to the base case. So as a result, the non-participant bill impacts of utility-owned solar on the right of this figure are marginally higher with the west-facing panels and with the south-facing panels. Though I will say, kind of on net, they're pretty negligible. Let's go to the next slide. So we observe in the base case results that the shareholder and ratepayer impacts of utility-owned rooftop solar are driven significantly by the effects of adding solar PV capex to the utility's rate base. And those effects are a function of the size of the capex, net of any tax credits, as well as the utility's capital structure. All of these elements are highly uncertain, for sure, and can vary significantly from case to case. So we developed some sensitivity cases to look at each element in isolation. So first, the installed cost of rooftop solar PV has declined significantly over the past decade, but it's unclear how sustainable those trends will remain going forward. And it's also unclear how the cost of rooftop solar might differ under a large-scale utility procurement compared to more conventional ownership structures. Though the ability to purchase in volume in that case might drive costs down, we'd also note that rate-regulated utilities face a fundamental structural incentive, often called the Average-Johnson or AJ effect, to expand capital outlays. So to capture these varied uncertainties, the far left bar in the figures shows utility earnings and bill impacts across a wide but empirically grounded range in residential rooftop solar capital costs from $1.5 per watt to $3.5 per watt. From the lower to the higher end of this solar cost range, utility-owned rooftop solar boosts shareholder earnings by 1.8 to 5.1%, while increasing non-participant bills by 1.1 to 2.9% relative to our no PV case. The second element we looked at was the continued availability of federal investment tax credit, or ITC, and this is uncertain as well, as is the ability of regulated utilities to fully monetize the value of those credits. As two boundary cases, we considered scenarios where, in the low case, the utility receives a 10% ITC, which is the low end of the federal ITC phase down, while in the high case, it receives a credit equal to 30% of all capital expenditures on rooftop solar, assuming a continuation of historical levels. Across this range, you can see in the figure, in the middle bar, shareholder earnings are about 3.1 to 4% higher than in the no PV case, while non-participant bills are 1.8 to 2.3% higher, where the upper end of those ranges corresponds to the no tax credit scenario. Last, among the factors related to rate-basing rooftop solar are the utility's cost of capital, which depends partly on the authorized return on equity, or ROE, granted by the utility's regulator. We consider a range in authorized ROEs that reflect recent historical U.S. averages. Those historical average ROEs vary across a relatively narrow range from about 9.25% to 10.25%. So, as do the results you see here of the sensitivity shown in the far right bar of the figures. So we see that the utility's authorized ROE is a relatively unimportant factor in considering the cost of rate-basing rooftop solar. Performance-based incentives that seek to encourage utility investment in rooftop solar through higher authorized returns may therefore have a limited impact given our results. Let's go to the next slide. The last sensitivity case we wanted to share was around the rooftop rental payment to host customers. The operating costs of the utility-owned rooftop solar program consist of three broad categories. 1, program operating costs, 2, operations and maintenance, and 3, customer lease payments. Program administration includes costs associated with marketing, accounting, and regulatory compliance, and some of these are part of the so-called soft costs that non-utility solar developers also bear. O&M costs consist of ongoing monitoring and repairs of the rooftop solar system. And finally, the third component, customer lease payments, are those monthly payments to homeowners for the use of their rooftops. Of the various program operating costs, it's the customer lease payments that are both the largest and arguably the most uncertain and speculative element. Several recent programs that we looked at have offered a $30 monthly payment to participating customers, which is the same as our base case assumption. But a large-scale program, such as the one we've modeled, might necessitate larger payments in order to motivate the high levels of participation we've assumed. Conversely, a utility may be able to reduce these payments over time as it becomes more effective at marketing the program and customers become more comfortable with the arrangement. So given this uncertainty, we consider a range in monthly lease payments from $10 to $50 a month, based roughly on the observed range in land lease payments provided to landowners by large-scale solar and wind energy projects. We show the change in non-participant bills here only because they have no impact on utility shareholder earnings. They're assumed to be an operating cost and excluded from the rate base on which shareholder earnings are derived, as well as collected directly from ratepayers via a bill tracker or rider. But we can see in the results they're a significant driver of non-participant bill impacts. As you can see in the figure itself, varying the monthly lease payments across the range that we modeled here from either $10 to $50 a month lease payment corresponds to an increase in non-participant bills from about 1.4 to 2.5% relative to our no PV scenario. So one conclusion from this is that minimizing rooftop rental payments can reduce program bill impacts. So we'd also note, though, there's also some trade-off with program adoption that may occur, and this balance needs to be carefully considered. So with that, I'll pass the mic back over to Galen.
All right, thanks, Andy. And I guess before I begin, I'll just kind of re-encourage everyone to continue sending in those questions. We've gotten some good ones so far, but we certainly have time for some additional ones as well. So before wrapping things up, I wanted to just discuss a few other important factors that might also swing the results in some meaningful way. Although we didn't model these kind of quantitatively, I think the results that we have developed allow us to kind of talk more qualitatively about how altering certain assumptions would then impact the results. So I wanted to highlight three particular factors here. First is that within our base case analysis, we assume, as Andy described, that under host-owned or third-party owned PV, that the systems are net metered under primarily a volumetric tariff. And this is a relatively generous way of compensating rooftop solar. Some states are moving away from this kind of rate structure towards less generous compensation schemes, either by replacing net metering with some sort of successor tariff, or by moving away from purely volumetric rates to rate structures that have maybe higher fixed charges or demand charges. And so we can just kind of look at the results and understand how that kind of movement away from our assumed rate structure would impact the results. In particular, we would expect to see less utility revenue erosion occurring under non-utility owned PV structures, and thus less of a change in utility shareholder earnings, and also less of a change in non-solar customer rates relative to no PV. And so as a result, utility ownership would then have less to offer in relative terms. In other words, there would be less of a problem left to solve, and so the quote-unquote solution here in the form of utility ownership would be less valuable. Second, in focusing on a southeastern investor-owned utility, inherently we're picking utility with relatively low underlying retail electricity rates, somewhere I think in the neighborhood maybe 11 to 12 cents per kilowatt hour on average. All else being equal, a utility with higher retail electricity rates would see bigger issues under traditional rooftop solar ownership structures in terms of the shareholder earnings erosion and bill impacts to non-participants. And so in that case, utility ownership would then have more to offer as a potential mitigation method. This is basically the converse kind of outcome from the previous one. And then last, the utility in our analysis has little solar generation in its portfolio beyond the model rooftop PV in our analysis. And so if instead we were looking at a high solar penetration future where the utility had a lot of additional existing or planned solar generation in its portfolio, you might also see relatively high solar integration costs on the margin. And so in that case, there might be a perhaps a stronger case for utility ownership to the extent that allowing the utilities to own the solar provides some unique or enhanced ability to better manage those integration costs, either through curtailment or some sort of grid services. So those are, I think, at least in our view, three of the kind of most significant ways in which the underlying conditions of our analysis might change and how that might impact the results, though certainly there are other possibilities out there that we haven't necessarily considered here. So with that, let me just kind of try to boil everything down as best as I can to some kind of key takeaways. So, we went into this analysis really trying to determine whether utility ownership might offer one of these proverbial win-wins where both the utility shareholders and the ratepayers are decidedly better off than they would be under the status quo. What we found instead is something more like a win-wash, at least within our base case analysis, where utility shareholders clearly got a win, but the outcome for ratepayers, for non-participants, was more or less equivalent to what would occur under non-utility ownership, and was certainly worse than what would occur in the absence of any rooftop solar. The analysis does, though, I think, point towards a few options for how this kind of business model might pencil out a bit more favorably for customers as well. First, as our sensitivity analysis showed, minimizing the utilities CapEx outlays for the rooftop PV program can be a particularly powerful lever. And so, that is going to be, an important part of program design in terms of kind of really trying to figure out how to leverage the utilities bulk purchasing power as much as possible. Our sensitivity analysis also showed that minimizing the rooftop rental payments to customers can be another important lever. Though, as Andy mentioned, there are limits to how far you can go in that direction, especially if the goal is to implement this kind of program at scale, which might, at least in the near term, require relatively large rental payments in order to generate the participation levels that one might be seeking. One other key area, which we kind of only explored to a limited extent, is to design the program in such a way as to facilitate higher value forms of deployment than would otherwise occur. So that might be, for example, geo-targeting particular locations on the grid where rooftop PV has particularly high value, by integrating storage, by incorporating more grid interactive features in the system design. These are all things, of course, that can be done without utility ownership, but one might see how utility ownership could be an efficient mechanism for facilitating some of those things. And then last, and this one is maybe kind of like, if you don't like the answer, ask a different question, but it might also make sense to think about outcomes for ratepayers less in terms of average bill impacts and instead more in terms of equity related outcomes like participation rates among low income customers, especially if that is one of the objectives of the program in the first place. So those are just a few kind of possible ideas for how this kind of program design might get closer to that win-win that we went into this analysis wondering whether we might find. So with that, I will kind of close out the formal presentation part of the webinar. It looks like we've got about 20 minutes left for Q&A. I see we've got 6 questions that folks have input, so I think we'll certainly have time to get through those and maybe any others that folks would like to ask. So I will kind of moderate this Q&A, but Andy and I will both kind of tag team in fielding some of these responses. So I'm going to just go through more or less sequentially in the order of the questions that as we received them. But again, folks should feel free to ask more questions if any are on your mind. So first question, utility owned is connected on the utility side of the meter. Are these really comparable then? What benefits do host customers receive? And so I think, the answer to the last part of that question is that host customers receive a benefit in the form of a monthly payment from the utility for use of their rooftop. In our base case analysis, we assume that that was about $30 a month, which is, kind of roughly on par with the net bill savings that customers might receive under a third-party ownership structure, where their savings on their utility bill, but then they've got a monthly lease payment to the third-party solar owner. $30 a month is probably on par with what many customers might be receiving, more or less. Also, if a customer owns the system outright, we did a little bit of analysis to just kind of understand what the net present value would be, and a $30 monthly payment kind of gives you a similar net present value. So for the host customer, we tried to design this analysis so that they were kind of economically indifferent between these different ownership structures. Though certainly there are other types of benefits that a customer might receive above and beyond any direct bill savings, and those certainly could differ here. Andy, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add to that one.
The only thing I would just repeat is something I think you kind of covered in the conclusions, just that these types of programs may be of more interest to customers that wouldn't otherwise be financially able for certain outlays for host-owned PV. They may, like as Galen noted, be particularly important for LMI type program deployments, or in areas where you don't have it's maybe multifamily housing or other types of factors. So I think there's maybe some non-direct comparability just in terms of utility ownership of rooftop solar may be able to be targeted at customers that wouldn't otherwise be owning it themselves or able to sign up with a third party.
Yeah, that's right. Next question, were any distribution upgrades assumed in the 8% base case scenario? I think the answer to that is no, but Andy, I'm going to defer to you on that.
Yeah, that's correct. There were no distribution upgrades associated with the PV that was assumed in the base case scenario. I'm assuming that question is related to that distribution upgrade specific to the PV. Now, of course, in our modeling assumptions, what we did was the PV is only deferring growth-related T&D capital investments. There's a portion of T&D capital investments the utility is assumed to make regardless of its growth in peak demand, right? Utilities often have to replace aging infrastructure and make regular replacement of CapEx or of transmission distribution equipment regardless of those growth levels. So there is some kind of background level of T&D CapEx investments that are being made every year, and it's the PV defers some portion of just the growth-related piece of that.
Alrighty, the next question we received was, aren't you really evaluating net energy metering and not utility-owned PV more generally? NEM is usually seen as a startup incentive measure. Other PV rate designs for customer-owned are possible. So this is a great question, and I think probably came in before the next to last slide, where I talked about how the outcomes might differ if we were to assume some less generous compensation scheme for our non-utility owned case. So that's absolutely true. I mean, I think one could sort of look at our analysis and say, hey, you guys sort of stacked the deck here by assuming kind of the worst possible outcome for traditional ownership by assuming full net metering with volumetric rates. And that would be, a fair criticism. And so that's why we wanted to acknowledge how the results would differ if we were to have instead assumed some other underlying kind of compensation scheme for the behind the meter PV. So that's absolutely fair question, good question. And I think, that is obviously really a key condition that would impact the value of utility ownership. Next question here. Is the base case assumption for the host payment, the $30 per kilowatt per month, is this close to a cone-based payment? So cone, I assume, is cost of new entry. So I guess first, just a sort of point of clarification on that $30 payment. So that is a $30 per customer payment, not $30 per kilowatt payment. On a per kilowatt basis, it would obviously be quite a bit less, since I think we're assuming about a 6 or so kilowatt size system. So no, it's not based on cost of new entry. As I mentioned in response to one of the other questions, that $30 per customer per month is based both on looking at some of the existing pilots and what payment rates they were offering, but also doing a little bit of analysis to look at what the economics look like for the customer under traditional ownership structures, and trying to develop a rooftop rental payment rate that kind of gives a similar economic outcome for the customer. Anything that you'd like to add there, Andy?
The only thing I would add here is that certainly as you mentioned, the payments really meant to reflect the financial benefits, or be close to what was being enjoyed under the host or third-party owned model. I think sitting behind this question suggests perhaps the payments could be structured around the types of benefits that the cost-saving benefits or avoided cost benefits that the solar is providing, and how to compensate that. And I think that also just points out the usefulness of financial analysis like this, in which you can both quantify what are the benefits that are being produced in terms of T&D CapEx deferrals and fuel and purchase power cost reductions, and then observe if you're setting incentive levels commensurate with that or not.
Great, thanks, Andy. Next question: are you going to put a lien on the house? So I think really the question is does utility ownership imply or require some sort of lien on the house? And I don't think it does. I don't believe that that's been a provision in any of the pilots that have been offered. But I think the question sort of alludes to this more general issue of how would this potentially impact the homeowner's sort of financial stability or credit worthiness, and how might it impact the ability of the homeowner to then sell their home. And those are important questions for sure. Those are issues that I would say come up under sort of normal third-party ownership structures, non-utility ownership structures as well. And the market has sort of somewhat figured out a way, we'll say, to deal with that, though I think certainly there are also some open questions. But yeah, I mean, I think that's one of those sort of thornier sets of policy issues that utilities and regulators would need to think about before they ever went all in on this kind of business model. Andy, anything else that you'd like to add?
Nope, I think that's spot on.
Okay. And then let's see, we've got a couple more questions here. Is reduced peak load the only system benefit you're considering? It seems that utilities could also reap some reliability/resilience benefits and get rewarded via incentive regulation, especially if systems allow customer islanding. So Andy, why don't I let you actually field this one first, and say, I'm sure you'll have a good answer.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I'll have an answer for sure. We'll see if it's good. So yeah, in one sense, yeah, the peak load is driving a lot of the reductions in the utility costs that we described, particularly the generation, transmission, and distribution CapEx deferrals. Obviously, the reduced retail sales in the host-owned case, because it's behind the meter, also reduce the level of the utility sales upon which certain fuel and purchase power costs are based. And then when the utility, in the utility ownership case, the solar generation asset that they now have on the rooftops displaces fuel and purchase power costs on a similar kind of sales basis. But I think the point of this question is what are some of the other benefits the utility might receive For sure, I think this is one of the difficulties is that for sure these types of systems, and ownership structures on both sides of whether it's host-owned or utility-owned may provide reliability and resilience benefits for sure. How those get translated into actual utility costs from an accounting perspective is not as clear, right? As how certain costs are driven by peak demand or retail sales primarily. So I think for sure that it could be assessed, but you would have to take that extra step to say, well, these costs are associated specifically with reliability and resilience. And certainly, performance-based rate making and other broader utility business model proposals that are out there, as well as that have been implemented in certain states, do include some incentives and metrics specifically for reliability and resilience. And so to the extent these types of ownership structures help the utility meet those broader goals, for sure, that would be just an additional benefit from the utility perspective, utility shareholder perspective here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andy. I think I don't have anything more to add myself there. Next question. This seems to be oriented toward vertically integrated utilities. Have you looked at the financial impacts on a restructured utility with no generation requirement where generation is acquired through a competitive wholesale market? Well, I think, Andy, you can probably answer this question better. I'll just mention first, though, that we didn't, within this particular study, look at any utilities operating within a restructured market, though we have done similar kinds of analyses in the past focused on utilities in those types of markets. And I think one of the main differences, though, in those cases is that the utilities, the deferral, the kind of CapEx deferrals on the generation side, they don't impact the utility earnings, because those costs for a restructured utility, those costs tend to just be essentially fuel and purchase power type costs, since they're buying capacity through the power market and those costs are passed through. So the earnings impact to shareholders look very different, mostly because under the sort of status quo non-utility ownership structure, well, really, I guess under both ownership structures, you're not deferring utility capital investments in the same way or in the same magnitude as you are in vertically integrated markets.
Yeah, that's right. And notwithstanding the fact that for many restructured utilities, they may not actually even be allowed to own rooftop solar if they're obviated from owning generation. So this model may not even work in those markets anyways.
Yeah. Okay, next question here. What was your assumption on payback period for a customer ownership scenario? So we didn't really make any assumption there per se. We stipulated a certain level of deployment, 8%, ramping up to 8% of residential electricity sales over 10 years. So that there was no real assumption there. I did mention, though, that in setting our $30 a month rooftop rental payment for the utility ownership structure, we did, just as a sort of validation step, try to estimate what the net present value for a host-owned system would be, and wanted to make sure that this $30 per month payment kind of gave a similar net present value. And in that case, again, we didn't make any assumption for payback period, though the payback period was more of an output that came out of that kind of intermediate analysis. Next question, has the ability for utilities to utilize the ITC, the investment tax credit, changed? I was under the impression that due to the tax normalization rules, utilities had to spread the ITC benefits over the life of the asset. So Andy, I will let you take this one.
I wanted to see how long it would take before somebody brought up tax normalization. Yeah, this is I think understood as one of the biggest impediments to utility ownership of solar. So in our model, we reduce the CapEx cost of the solar by the ITC amount, given our base case assumptions as well as what I mentioned in our sensitivity cases. We reduce it over the lifetime of the asset and set the depreciation for the asset lifetime. And so in my non-tax professional understanding, we are following the rules insofar as utilities, as the comment noted, have to spread the benefits over the lifetime of the asset. So we're in accordance with that. But for sure, this is when it gets into actual practice, especially for utilities that often enjoy accelerated depreciation of their assets as a potential cash flow benefit. This can raise some concerns there. So it's a great question. I think this is something that policymakers continue to wrestle with, and my understanding is that they're currently exploring some of these issues right now.
Okay, I think we maybe have time for one last question here. Was there any impact to electricity consumption assumed from the adoption of customer-sided solar? In other words, in addition to solar generation from a customer-sided behind-the-meter installation, there is a theory of reduced electricity consumption by the host once they understand their consumption habits related to the new information about consumption relative to solar generation. So answer to that is no. We didn't assume any dynamic response between the adoption of solar and customer consumption. I suppose somebody could also hypothesize the opposite effect, that there might be some sort of rebound where, you know, customer has solar on their roof and then suddenly it's like, woohoo, let's, you know, turn the AC up and, you know, turn everything on full bore. We didn't look at any of that stuff. Obviously, you know, that could impact the results in some marginal ways, but that was not something we took up within this analysis. So with that, we are now basically at the top of the hour, so I'm going to close things out. Want to most of all just thank all of you for joining here today. This was a good turnout. We will be, as I mentioned, posting a recording of the webinar along with the webinar slides on our website, on the URL that I listed at the bottom of the first slide, which obviously you can't all see now, but you know what, actually, you know what we can do? I think that we can just email this slide deck to all of the participants. So, you know, we'll do that. We'll email this slide deck out to everybody who registered. And through that, you will get then the URL at the bottom here where you can then access a recording of the webinar as well as downloadable versions of the published article as well. All right, again, thanks everybody for joining. If anybody has kind of further questions or feedback, feel free to shoot Andy or I an email. And otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week. All right, take care. Bye-bye.